제1회 광주광역시 전국 영어토론대회 예선 당일 대회장은 전국에서 모여든 학생들로 붐비고 있습니다. 중등부 50개 팀, 고등 국내부 70개 팀, 고등 국외부 50개 팀 등 총 170개의 학생팀이 참가한 전국 최대 규모의 청소년 영어토론 대회였는데요. 토론을 준비하는 학생들의 얼굴이 조금 긴장한 듯 보입니다. 최근 영어 토론은 학생들의 사고력과 언어 능력을 동시에 효율적으로 향상시킬 수 있는 새로운 영어 교육 수단으로 주목받고 있는데요. 덕분에 전국 각지에서 영어 토론 대회 개최 열기도 뜨겁습니다.
Types of judges. For most preliminary rounds, we will have panels.
그냥 하는 회화보다는 토론 같은 거는 자신의 의사를 더 강력하게 표현을 할 수 있는 능력이 필요하기 때문에 영어 토론 대회가 더 그런 능력을 키워주기엔 좋은 것 같아요.
회화 같은 것은 그냥 단순히 의사소통을 전달하는 기능인데 토론은 논리력하고 논리력 같은 것을 배양할 수 있으니까 그게 더 중요하다고 생각합니다.
영어 토론은요, 일단은 토론 주제에 대해서 많은 걸 알고 있어야지 자연스럽게 얘기할 수 있기 때문에 많은 그 영어 읽기를 수반을 합니다. 그러고 나서 직접적으로 말하기 전에 자기가 할 말을 정리를 해야 되니까 역시나 또 쓰기 과정이 있고요. 그거 이제 실제 그 토론에 들어가서 말하고 자기 의견을 말할 때 말하기 연습, 그리고 상대방의 의견을 잘 들어서 반대 의견을 개진해야 되니까 듣기 연습까지 해서 총 읽기, 말하기, 듣기를 통합적으로 할 수 있는 그런 좋은 교육 방법이라고 생각해서 아이들한테 추천했습니다.
이번 대회는 11월 20일부터 21일까지 이틀에 걸쳐 진행되었습니다. 20일 비공개로 열린 예선은 강의실마다 자격을 갖춘 심사위원이 동석하며 학생들은 사전에 발표한 지정 토론과 즉흥 토론 두 가지 방식을 통해 평가받게 됩니다.
우선적으로 이제 토론자들의 우선 논리력에 가장 큰 중점을 두고 저희가 심사를 하게 되고요. 논리력을 볼 때 저희가 크게 세 가지로 나눠가지고 보게 되는데, 어떤 그 내용의 충실성과 그다음에 그 전달력, 그리고 이제 그 내용을 전달하는 데 있어서 어떤 전략들, 뭐 시간이라던가 아니면 뭐 제스처 이런 것들 어떤 전략성을 보는 크게 세 가지로 나눠가지고 저희가 토론을 심사하고 있습니다.
예선을 통과한 팀은 본선으로 진출하게 되며 모든 토론은 예선에서 결선까지 리그 및 토너먼트 형식으로 진행되었습니다. 우승팀은 중등부, 고등 국내부, 고등 국외부 각 한 팀씩 총 3팀. 우승팀에게는 현금 200만 원의 장학금이, 준우승팀에게는 현금 100만 원의 장학금이 수여됩니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to begin the grand final of today's debating championship. Before we get started, I'd like to congratulate the two teams on advancing to the final round of the debate. On the government bench, we have Team Far East Movement. Please welcome them again with a round of big applause. And on the opposition side is Team Saucer 1300. Please also welcome them with a round of big applause. Thank you very much. Today, we have the motion that this House believes that the G20 has no practical implications. And without much ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to the podium.
Now, before we go into talk about the important issues regarding G20 and its practical implications, let's define what practical implications are. And on the House of the Government, we would like to define practical implications as actually yielding results in accordance with the goals of G20. And we think that this definition is very clear for both the government side and the opposition side. Now, under this definition, the government side would present 3 arguments in support of today's motion. The first argument being how G20 is non-binding, how it doesn't assure the member nations to abide by their promises. The second argument about the contradictions in composition that prevent practical implications of G20. The third argument about the nature of conferences and how it makes G20 impractical. And the first argument will be dealt by the first speaker, me. The second and third argument will be dealt by the Deputy Prime Minister Tae-han in his speech. Now that we're done with the split and the definition, let's go on to look at the important issue, G20 and its practical implications, how it's non-binding. Now, I have 5 points of analysis for the first argument. The first point being how G20 has no enforceable how the members of G20 has no enforceable commitments. The second point of analysis being how there is no such dispute settlement policies that exists in other intergovernmental organizations such as World Trade Organization. The third point of analysis being how there is no incentive for member nations of G20 to contribute to enhance and facilitate G20. The fourth point of analysis being how the absence of permanent secretariat in G20 prevents practical implications. And finally, how all of that leads to no agreements or no treaties being made in G20, preventing it from having practical implications. Now let's go on to look at the first point of analysis being how it does not have any enforceable commitments. Now, in World Trade Organization, when a country wants to change its bindings, like go against the original contract with another country or with another partner country, the country has to go through negotiations, and the country has to compensate for the loss of trade that the partners or the parties that have interest in that contract loses with the breach of the contract that the nation commits. Therefore, in World Trade Organizations, member nations have to compensate other nations for the loss of trade when they want to break a certain contract or when they want to breach a promise or treaty that they originally made. However, in G20, there is no such enforceable commitment. When China makes a promise to reform its currency system to benefit the world economy at the G20, and a year later, they can say that they don't want to. Their agenda has changed, their situation, circumstances have changed. So they don't want to reform their currency system. And there is no punitive measure for China because there is no enforceable commitment within G20 to assure that China abides by its promise made at G20. Now, the second point of analysis being how there is no dispute settlement. Now, in World Trade Organization, if fellow members are violating trade rules, they will use the multilateral system of settling disputes instead of taking action unilaterally. What this means is that in World Trade Organization, if a country and another country has some kind of disputes in regards to trade, in regards to treaties and contracts, what happens is it's not about this country and that and the another country going against each other and having disputes, but it's about dealing the matter within the organization that is the World Trade Organization. And a lot of parties are involved in this dispute, such as the World Trade Organization Secretariat, the arbitrators, independent experts from other organizations and specialized institutions are involved in settling disputes of two different countries whose interests are in conflict. However, in G20, there is no such dispute settlement that helps two countries or two groups of countries help resolve their differences in opinions. Therefore, we see that in G20, it is harder to reach a compromise, harder to have practical implications on the world economy and domestic economies of their member nations. Now, the third point of analysis is this, about how member nations have no incentive to contribute to the organization, to enhance it and facilitate it. Now, in International Monetary Fund, there is something called contribution-voting share. It means that if a country contributes more financially to the organization that is International Monetary Fund, they have more share of the voting power, meaning that country has this incentive to contribute physically more to the International Monetary Fund. meaning that all the member nations of the International Monetary Fund will contribute as much as they can if they want to have more influence in the International Monetary Fund. However, at G20, there is no such system under which more contribution means more voting shares. Therefore, member nations of G20 has no incentive to make G20 a better organization, to enhance it or to facilitate it. Therefore, G20 has no future of becoming a better, a more practical organization. And the fourth point of analysis is this: how the absence of permanent secretariat at G20 prevents it from having practical implications. Now, G20 once tried to have permanent secretariat. However, China, Brazil disagreed. On the other hand, Japan and Italy agreed. So in conclusion, there was no establishment of secretariat. What this means is that there is nobody, no party that monitors, that oversees, that sometimes steps in to gather people, to gather different opinions, and sometimes steps in to give new ideas. Therefore, we see that these member nations have no supervising body under which they can interact with, they can compromise, they can make compromises, under which they can form declarations, or whether it be declarations or treaties or agreements. Now, all of these factors that make G20 impractical leads to my final point of analysis, and how in contrast to World Trade Organization, G20 has not made any agreements or treaties so far. World Trade Organization so far oversees 60 agreements, and two prominent ones are first the Treaty of Agriculture, and the second one, Treaty of Intellectual Property. And we see that these two treaties play a key role in defining the terms of intellectual property and defining how the agricultural exports of different countries are going to be mediated. And we see that these agreements and treaties are not going to be made in G20 because it's non-binding, and the countries are not going to abide by their promises. So in conclusion, we see that G20 has no practical implication on the world economy nor on the domestic level. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes 29 seconds.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister. Now, I'd like to hear from the Leader of the Opposition. Leader of the Opposition, please come to the podium.
Solution through communication, progress through dialogue. G20 has practical implications, ladies and gentlemen. Team Opposition presents you with 3 strong arguments in today's debate to support our claim that the G20 indeed does have practical implication. First of all, that the G20 facilitates international cooperation and promotes dialogue. Secondly, the benefits of press coverage and that's contribution to promoting an environment of exchange of ideas and communication. And lastly, how the G20 promotes exchange in the private sector as well, and how that leads to additional benefits and additional practical implications for the G20. Now, before moving on to our off-case arguments, I'd like to first step in to rebutting the few points mentioned by the Prime Minister. Now, we find the first problem in the PM's case about its definition. They said that in their definition, they say practical implications are actually yielding results in accordance with the goals of the G20. But in fact, they failed to show us exactly what the goals of the G20 is. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to tell you what the goals of the G20 was. According to the mission statement of the London 2009 summit, we strongly believe that prosperity through cooperation should be the goals of the G20, and therefore we believe that this is a scope from which we must discuss today's debate. Now, on the Prime Minister's first argument about how it's non-binding, the first subpoint was about no enforceable commitments. We have two rebuttals to this. First of all, communication and exchange of ideas actually enables us to take a step further and actually coming up with a solution. The exchange of ideas have proved to actually produce tangible results, which I will elaborate in my arguments. Also, agreements have been passed on to binding bodies like the International Monetary Fund, and therefore, in these organizations, more specific agreements have been made. Through the G20, what we have are guidelines and principles. And when these guidelines and principles are sent to international organizations with binding power, we see that practical solutions and practical policies, specific policies, are actually being devised. And this I would like to elaborate further on in my off-case argument. Also, the
Point, sir.
second subpoint, no, thank you, was that there is no dispute settlement policy. First of all, we believe that disputes have been already settled in many cases, regardless of what they argue about there being no dispute settlement policy. And because we believe that they failed to elaborate upon this point, that this rebuttal is enough.
Point, sir.
No, thank you. On their third point, about no incentive, we believe that G20 states have a common incentive for common prosperity. And as this is the case, they have an incentive not to have the other nations' policy go against their interests, and therefore they do have an incentive to cooperate and voice out their opinions actively in the global stage. Also, on their fourth subpoint about the absence of a permanent secretariat, we still believe that the G20 has practical implications, as was in the case of the G8, which also didn't have a permanent secretariat. What we saw was close interaction between the head of states and finance ministers, as well as other public servants, and how that led to the contribution of producing a better solution for the future and the world. Ladies and gentlemen, also on the last issue about no agreements being made, we believe that this is factually incorrect, as I will prove on later in my arguments. Now, moving on to our first off-case argument about how it facilitates international cooperation and promotes dialogue and enables solutions, ladies and gentlemen. We see that there is a clear need in today's world for international cooperation. Global challenges demand a common and unified answer, a common policy, ladies and gentlemen. This is the reason of existence of the G20. G20 promotes dialogue and better cooperation, as two facets of the G20 actually enable this. First of all, its process. Greater personal contact and more common understanding of policy changes is what comes as a result of G20 summits and meetings, ladies and gentlemen. The G7 meetings, which have been held before the G20 meetings, substituted the G8, which came from the G7, ladies and gentlemen, is close and repeated personal contact and increased agreement on what the other perspective is. And therefore, we see that the same things are actually taking place, and the same things will continue to take place in future G20 summits as well. Another major point is about efficiency. Summit meetings means that head of states gather together, ladies and gentlemen, and discuss the matter, and decisions are made without the unnecessary delay that many other forms of negotiation do have, ladies and gentlemen. In most other cases of negotiations, representatives negotiate with the representatives of other nations, and when there is an agreement reached, they have to go back to the executive body, get their approval, and then come back. And what if they're rejected, ladies and gentlemen? They need to renegotiate from a clean slate, ladies and gentlemen. And this is why we believe that the G20 offers a clear and effective solution to the problems of the status quo. And now I'd like to elaborate further on this argument about presenting you with tangible results, ladies and gentlemen. In the 2009 London summit, ladies and gentlemen, about approximately $1.1 trillion in additional loans and guarantees to bail out troubled countries was a principle agreed upon by the member states of the G20. In the Gwangju agreements in 2010, they agreed to expand the representation of emerging market countries by 6%, ladies and gentlemen. And they also endorsed an expansion of an IMF lending programs to failing countries suffering from credit crunches, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that these principles have been established, and as I mentioned to you in my rebuttal speech, we believe that these principles get passed on to other international organizations with binding force and are actually implemented and conveyed into practical and specific policies, ladies and gentlemen. Also, in the Seoul Agreement in 2010, they required banks to increase risk-free capital from the average of 2% in the status quo to 7% by the year 2015, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that this is significant progress on the part of an international conference, ladies and gentlemen. Another major issue that I'd like to bring up is our second argument about the benefits of press attention. G20 agenda received great public spotlight, ladies and gentlemen. Suggestions and predictions about G20 agendas are presented from various media, ladies and gentlemen. Columnists like Nicholas Kristof or Paul Krugman voiced out their opinions on what should be included in the G20 summit, and people discuss about these agendas. People express their opinions, a public forum is created, and it flourishes, ladies and gentlemen. Citizenry participation increases, and international concerns do receive public spotlight, and governments can actually take this into consideration in their policymaking. Ladies and gentlemen, the press influences citizens and encourages them to speak out and to voice out their opinions. And it actually contributes to problem solving through the exchange of ideas and enabling governments to take the opinions of their citizens into consideration. And this is exactly why we believe that this also contributes to the factor of practical implications. Solutions through communication, progress through dialogue, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes 12 seconds.
Now, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to the podium. Yes, please.
First of all, I really don't know what that was from the opposition. Was it a definitional challenge or just something to make a hassle about? We both agree on the fact that the G20 should push for the goals that it pursues, which are practical implications. We need real-life results. In their case, we don't see that. So in my speech, I'll do two things. I'll look at the government case and move on to the opposition case, look at both points from both sides. So let's look at the government case. We told you that G20 will not yield any practical implications because, in essence, it is non-binding. We gave you a various amount of points. We told you, first of all, it has no permanent secretariat. Secondly, it has no enforcing mechanisms. Thirdly, no dispute settlement mechanisms. Fourthly, no incentive for countries to cooperate because there is no voting system present. Their first rebuttal was that it enables communications. Well, communications happen all the time. It's not only in the G20 that communications happen, but communications don't always mean real-life results. We want to see the link between what kind of communications brought what kind of results. We only heard agreements from the opposition and no real-life results that actually benefit the whole of G20, which is another aspect I'll talk about. Their second and third arguments was that there's no dispute in the first place at all, and everybody has an incentive not to go against each other's agendas because they want to cooperate to receive better results. This is utterly untrue. One of the main focuses of this year's G20 was to resolve the currency war that is impending. It was a currency war between China and America. However, both states refused to make any policies, any agreements on this issue. We therefore see that there is a dispute, it was not settled, and therefore we can come to the conclusion that these people are doing these things because there's no incentive to cooperate. There is no binding power. Sit down, sir. Their fourth and final rebuttal was very similar to one of their points. They said that the close cooperation of state heads and financial directors moved to various projects that yield a lot of results. Once again, because the state heads are the only people coming to the summit, we see a lack of professional knowledge. Because it's only 2 days, we don't see that much in-depth communication as they would have you believe. Let's go to the second point of today's government case. Secondly, we say that contradictions in the composition of G20 prevent practical implications. First of all, the first contradiction is that there's a very whimsical standard of membership. Who chose 20 countries? It was one official in France. This always comes up with the question, why not make a G21? Why not make a G22? It always excludes the person on the board. It always excludes a very crucial stakeholder that is whimsically excluded from all of these discussions, and we don't see why this standard is still existing. The second contradiction in the G20 is its membership regarding developing nations. It sets out to form a lot of policies for developing nations, such as PCLs or FCLs. At the same time, what it does is it pushes forward neoliberalistic ideals. It tells the IMF to double their financial base, so it gives more bargaining power to the IMF against developing countries. What it also does is it tells developing countries to raise their bank interest rates so they can't really go forth with attackative fiscal policies, which they use to develop in their own past. They also do not let these countries go for tariffs or any other kind of trade that goes against their ideal of free trade, which they use to improve themselves. We see a clear contradiction that has not been justified by the opposition today. The third and final contradiction we see is the contrast between the BRICS and the old Western powers. There's a clear conflict here. Although there was a 3-page communique between China and USA, there wasn't a single word from China about reevaluating the UN. There wasn't a single word about the US about refraining from further moves by the Federal Reserve to flood the US economy with money. Therefore, we didn't see a change in the currency war that is about to happen. Our third and final point today is that the nature of the conference makes it impossible for the G20 to yield practical results. First of all, it's a two-day biannual conference. Last year in Pittsburgh, the summits gathered and said that they would make resolutions about what to talk about in the next year's conference. Because there's no binding power, there's no incentive for these people to cooperate, this kind of delay is possible. Secondly, cooperations are not articulated into resolutions, and most of the negotiations are made backdoor. There is no media focus on what's happening happening really, because a lot of these negotiations don't really appear on clear resolutions. Finally, all of these agreements are one-dimensional. They only focus on the economic perspective. They don't see a lot of other aspects that can be integrated into one final solution, such as the environment, technology transfer, or all of these other things. Because they only focus on the economic sector with only the head states negotiating, we see a clear dearth of professional knowledge, and that's exactly why I'd like to move on to the opposition case. Before we do that, let's take that POI.
The original purpose of the G20 was to solve economic disputes. It contradicts with your definition with what you just said.
What kind of economic dispute did it solve? Did it solve the currency war that is impending? We'd like to see evidence from the opposition why they're so ardent in saying that it solved anything when it didn't, when they aren't showing any evidence as to what kind of economic crises that the G20 solved recently. Okay, so let's go on to the opposition case. Their first argument was that more contact leads to more communications and that G20 ensures efficiency. First of all, the conference is only 2 days. There's not that much contact that can't happen in other conferences. Secondly, about efficiency, they said that because only the head of states cooperate, there's going to be a lot of efficiency. We actually interpret a lack of representatives as an ineffective way of communicating. It's probably why the G20 summit is so brief, because the head of states don't have the professional knowledge that enable other representatives to come up with clear-cut resolutions, that these G20 summits don't really come up with resolutions that are comprehensive, that comprehend the actual status of these nations' economies. Secondly, their argument secondly, they showed us evidence about how in London they agreed to do a lot of things. First of all, it didn't take place. Secondly, their idea of the IMF helping developing countries led actually to a lot of conditional loans that actually crunched the economy of developing countries, such as in Southeast Asia. Their second point was that these conferences receive great press attention, and it talks about what should be included. That's exactly our point. First of all, it only talks about what should be included. Most of the negotiations that take place aren't really disclosed to the public, so we don't know what's happening. Secondly, we doubt their idea that the G20 instills a lot of debate among citizens. For myself, I didn't know that G20 was a 2-day conference. Looking from all the advertisements that the South Korean government runs, you would imagine the G20 to be a marathon conference that lasts at least 2 weeks with a lot of comprehensive details. The press attention usually focuses on the event itself, not the material that the event actually deals with. That is why it does not promise these press conference flashes benefits that they would have you believe. These are all the reasons today why you must vote for the government. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes 8 seconds.
Thank you. Now, let me move on to the next speaker, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Please go ahead and get started.
Ignorance on side government. That's the only thing we can see here. And this ignorance, we're going to explain 3 things. Firstly, they do not recognize the benefits or the practical implications that have already happened. They say that the G20, the G20 summit cannot have any practical implication because apparently it's ineffective, because it's so short, and because it doesn't have a set rule of procedures. Well, if that were true, and we've rebutted to each of these subpoints in our first speech, but even if we give them those points, if that were to stand, they needed to show that there have been no practical implications at all. That's the burden under their definition that they set up upon themselves today. But here I give you the example of the Washington Declaration. What is the Washington Declaration? In the Washington Declaration that was established in the first G20 summit, what happened was the discussion and the improved communication between these G20 countries, and they were able to clarify the root cause of the economic problem that they were facing, of the economic crisis that we were facing back in 2008.
1 point, ma'am.
No, thank you, sir. And with the identification of this root cause, what they were able to do is to set a basis for development, for these practical implications to come into space. Now, since they have not rebutted to our point about how the standards set by the G20 are actually passed on to bodies that do have the binding power to enact such policies, we believe that the practical implications stand. Firstly, because of the very characteristic of the G20, which provides a basic guideline, which then passes on these guidelines to bodies that have the binding power to enact these policies, therefore ending in their so-called goal of practical implications.
One question, ma'am.
No, thank you, sir. Now let's move on to some other petty rebuttals. They said that the communication doesn't foster any kind of practical implication, and the only example they mentioned was the currency war. The Seoul Summit, according to them, was something that was supposed to solve this currency war that's waging right now. Well, let me give you that. Let me revert to that point by saying that they actually did reach a conclusion on the point about the currency war by saying that we need more time to look at the situation, to assess the situation, to get more information about the situation. So what the leaders did, no thank you sir, was to set an agenda for the next year. So set an agenda for 2011 and say that we are going to solve that issue then. Because we recognize the need for more information, for a more thorough assessment of the situation, of the currency war that we face today, because they do not want a rash implication that would not work.
Point, ma'am.
No, thank you, sir. Now, another problem they mentioned with the G20 was the lack of expertise. Well, we give you another point where they have exemplified their ignorance for all of you to see. We see the very existence of Sherpas, who are negotiation experts that exist in the G20 system. The G20 summit is not only comprised of the heads of state, as they claim, as their ignorance claims. It's actually composed of these Sherpas and the leaders of other binding powers that they want to serve, such as WTO or the IMF. The representatives who have this expertise, according to their definition, no thank you, sir, do take part in the G20 summit. And what we say is that the increased communication between these leaders who represent the entities that have the binding power and the G20 heads of states, this is what provides the basis for practical implication. This is what directly leads to practical implication, to practical solutions to problems in today's world. No, thank you, sir. Now, they said that this was a whimsical stance, that Frenchmen just said 20 nations. Well, we don't see a problem with that when it actually has results. And as we've shown you that this has played a key role in solving the 2008 financial crisis, we don't see how that is such a bad thing when we see practical results, practical implications that have happened, that will happen directly from this G20 nations. They also mentioned that developing nations weren't, no, thank you, sir. Developing nations weren't getting enough of a stance in the G20. We see that's not a fact. As we see the leaders from the African Union taking part, as we see various leaders from these developing nations are being invited to take part, and that increased communication between developing nations and developed nations are actually what fosters the communication and provides, once again, a basis for practical implication that leads to practical solutions. We see that this case is, no thank you, sir, just simply does not stand on the side of the government. Now, without further ado, let me move on into our third argument, how it promotes exchange in the private sector. In our first two arguments, we told you that it promotes discussion in the public sector, how it promotes a discussion between citizens and the government, and how the leaders of the governments are able to communicate with each other on a more familiar level. In this argument, we're going to tell you about how it promotes exchange in private sectors between businesses. Now, why is this exchange so important? Because once again, we say that G20 is an arena for discussion and dialogue, not only for the heads of state who represent the governments, but the entities from the private sectors that do also participate. The G20 summit is not only a place, an arena of discussion for these heads of state, they're actually an arena of discussion for these private sectors as well, because they include a business summit. And what does this business summit do? This business summit opens the door for businessmen to directly present their case, firstly to the heads of states. So it increases communication between the private sector and the public sector. So they can solve the discrepancies within the policies, so they can cooperate in order for a better practical solution. Yes, sir.
So can you tell me one real-life change that happened as a result of this year's G20 summit?
One real-life change, as I keep mentioning again and again, is a solution to the 2008 financial crisis. If it were not for this G20 and clarifying the root cause of the 2008 financial crisis, no practical implication, no practical solution to solve that crisis would have happened. But without interruption, let me move on into the second point about this argument. The second point about this argument is that it actually increases communication between these businesses, not only between the business and the public sector, but between these private sector businesses as well. It actually manifests these communications, as we can see from the Seoul Business Summit. 120 CEOs from 34 countries gathered here, and 66 resolutions confirmed that had been presented in the previous 4 months, and we were able to reach conclusions to 66 important resolutions, including free trade, increase in investments abroad, and so on. But more importantly, interaction between companies, one-to-one interaction between one-to-one business meetings were able to culminate in discussions on know-how, contributing to the overall growth of the industry as a whole. So we on side opposition have told you about how it facilitates international cooperation, how it sets the basis for that, secondly, how it gives press attention, and lastly, how it promotes interaction between the private sector as well. So that discussion is necessary for the basis. And this is why we oppose. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes 31 seconds.
Thank you, Deputy Leader. Now I'd like to invite the government whip to the podium.
As the whip speaker of the government side today, I want to look over the debate in a very clear and concise manner. I want to look at 3 main issues. First of all, I want to look at the summit, the G20, before the summit actually happens. Then I want to look at the summit itself, what actually goes on in these meetings. Then third, I want to look at what actually happens after these meetings, the results. So moving on into the first point of issue in today's debate, the pre-summit issues. Now basically, our definition of practical implications was results according to goals. So there's a burden on the opposition side to prove that the G20 actually meets its goals of like mutual development and economic development for the world. But we say, and also, we talked about the reasons. We also talked about they needed to prove that there's a clear goal of the G20 and why the G20 actually works to meet these goals. And they give us an example about like the London summit and how they provided, they came to an agreement of an agenda. But we think that just simply having, like choosing your goals, deciding on your goals, like on the London summit, it actually just proves that the G20 really didn't have a goal to begin with. We think that the G20 really doesn't have anything. It has no binding power. It has no like treaty. Like for instance, the UN has the UN Charter to fall back on, but the G20 really doesn't have any set goals, set purposes. It's just 20 nations that come to a table and decide what to do. And we think that because the first argument of the government side, how it's non-binding, we're basically saying that it's not official. Basically what we're saying is that there's no legal binding, there's no mandate, and there's no commitment for these countries to do anything at all. Also, there's no clear guidelines for the procedures or the membership. The G20 itself agrees to the fact that there is no clear criteria of how they choose these members and how these 20 members actually came to exist. It's just 20 random countries that came to this table and said, we're going to help economic development. And we think there's a problem with this. We think that basically it means that, so we want to ask, how does 20 random countries actually become a vital organization that actually, represents the world and actually does bring benefits to our world? It's basically saying, it's like me arguing, like, I'm going to go up with Wongi and Taeyeon and just make a group for world peace. But really, that doesn't make sense. The actual existence of G20 raises a lot of questions. But we say it's still okay. It's still okay for me, Wongi and Taeyeon to actually get together and say that we're doing something. What's important is that whether or not they're really doing something, and which is what I want to address on the second part of the speech, which is the actual summit. What's happening in the summit? The opposition gave us like a big argument about international cooperation. It sounds good. Of course, like international cooperation is good, but I have 4 things to say to that. First of all, we're saying that there isn't that much cooperation in the status quo. In this whole summit, in the summits before that, you have countries fighting over the currency wars, and basically all the agreement that you have is that, okay, let's just put these things aside and let's just go to the next summit and discuss about some issues. But really, you haven't agreed on anything or any specific numerical terms, specific agendas, and we think that's a problem. The second thing that I want to say is that there's no secretariat. Basically, what we're saying is that there's no big leader or no body to actually intervene in some disputes. There's no body to actually handle the problems that come at the G20 meeting. We also said that the third thing I want to say is that there's no mechanism to settle disputes. What happens if me and Wongi fight over some stupid reason? There's no one to solve that problem, and there's no mechanism to solve that problem at all. So really what we're saying, what we see at the G20 is that we have 20 countries that somehow have to agree on their own, but they really haven't provided us why there's a clear mechanism that can solve future disputes. The fourth thing I want to say is that there's no incentive. What incentive is there for these countries to go out their way and bring all of this change to the world? For instance, we give you examples of the IMF and the WTO, which is a different case. The IMF, they're given voting power according to the amount of money and resources you actually invest into the IMF. But the G20, it's just 20 countries that really don't have an incentive. They fail to prove that there's an incentive that will make a clear reason for change. And having said these four things, the government's second argument was basically about how there's a contradictory composition of the G20 itself, how it's actually even worse. The first thing we want to talk about, the first contradictory aspect we want to talk about is the actual length of the procedure. The actual length of the G20 procedure is about 2 days. You have like 5 hours a day to discuss on very important, heavy international economic policies that's going to affect the world for years to come. I don't really think that 20 different people from 20 different nations that speak different languages can really put a specific and very thorough plan in just 2 days. We think there's a problem. It's contradictory. And the second thing we want to say is that the goals are focused specifically on the G20 country nations themselves and on economics. Basically, what we're saying is that these countries don't really have that much knowledge about the environment. They don't really care about countries in Africa, the third world countries. These 20 countries they take up 85% of the wealth of the world, and therefore, thus, it's more obvious that they will focus on developing and developed nations. They don't really focus on environmental issues. They don't focus on health issues. All of these issues that should be addressed. We think that there can be problems that come from the agreements themselves. So let's move on into the third and final aspect of today's debate. No, thank you, sir. Which is the results. After the summit, what happens? First of all, we said in the government, it's one of the arguments in our first argument, how it's non-binding. There's no legal binding. So basically, if you don't really want to follow some of the agreements that you had at the G20, you don't have to, because there's no legal procedure or legal binding that actually, puts you apart and says that you have to, have some kind of punishment. It's just an agreement made by 20 countries, and really, there's really no enforcing power between that. We think it's going to hinder the practical implications that they need to prove in today's debate. Also, the opposition, we heard, to make it simple, let's just look at the examples of these real-life practical implications that the opposition gave us. First of all, they talked about a 1.1 trillion stimulus package. But first of all, I want to ask you, how did that really help economic development around the world? How is that mutual prosperity for everyone? It didn't really affect the countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. They didn't really prove why a 1.1 trillion stimulus package was such an important thing for economies around the world. They also talked about the IMF, but the IMF loans are actually hurting developing nations because they can't pay off their loans. And also they talked about how they just set an agenda for future economic policies. But setting an agenda isn't enough. It's not a practical implication. They also talked about one of the things that G20 did was finding out the cause of the 2008-2009 economic recession. But that's not really a practical implication. Even Tan and Wongi know the cause of the 2008 economic recession. And basically, they really haven't given us, at the end of the debate, a clear reason or a clear example of a practical implication. And we on team opposition, on team government, argue that they will not and will never find a practical implication for the G20. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes 38 seconds.
Thank you. Now I'd like to welcome the opposition whip to the podium.
Every single progress until now started from somebody, somewhere, at least talking about something. Why? Because that's the very basis for any kind of progress to occur. It is the very basic step for any kind of practical implication, for any kinds of ends and actual enforcements to begin. And because G20 provides that very basic step for the solution road to actual enforcements and ends, We believe the motion must fall. So now I'm going to prove that to you by analyzing three main contention points of the debate. One, about G20's structure. And two, about the practical benefits and the G20's duty. And three, lastly, about the legitimacy of G20's gathering. So firstly, let's deal with the issue of G20's structural formation. Now, we've told you on this side of the house that G20 was established on the basis to solve economic problems and promote mutual development and mutual prosperity, ladies and gentlemen. Also, it was established for the purpose of providing an outlet for expressing economic stances of different nations and economic interests of different nations so that they can communicate. Now, we were the ones that provided that standard because the government side has failed in meeting their burden of initially activating their definition, in which they said that, that they'd be proving that G20 meets their initial goals, in which they didn't really even state the initial goals. Now, what we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is upon the first point when they talked about the enforcement mechanism doesn't exist, we've given you two consistent answers to that. Firstly, we've told you that once these agreements are made within the G20, they get passed on to bodies that actually do have enforcement mechanisms. We've reiterated this argument over and over again, ladies and gentlemen, yet we've heard no answer to it. So upon this point of the debate, I take that point as conceded. No, thank you. But also, ladies and gentlemen, once you do not follow by policies that are unilaterally agreed inside the G20, what happens is that your nation loses credibility. There are more chances that your nation's going to be isolated from future meetings, and your nation's self-interest is going to be reflected at a far less level. Therefore, even without the specific enforcement mechanism in place, there is a clear incentive for them to follow the policies in the first place. But lastly and thirdly, we also argue that even if the enforcement mechanism may not be as effective as in the case of the WTO or as in the case of IMF, what we say is that even without the enforcement mechanism, we see with other conferences such as the Copenhagen Conference or meetings at Montreal, that it facilitates national efforts even without that mechanism in place. Just because the enforcement mechanism is non-existent doesn't necessarily mean nations are willing to neglect the decisions made at the G20. But also they've told us that there's no dispute solving policy. But we've already told you and given you examples of how disputes are already solved. So it doesn't necessarily require that kind of a specific mechanism inside G20 in order to solve disputes. Communication can do that instead. But then they also told us that incentives are non-existent, therefore nations don't contribute to the G20. But we've also told you upon this point that nations pursue their own self-interest, which means that if they do not contribute to G20's meetings, if they are excluded from G20's decisions, their national interests are excluded from the unilateral decisions of the G20. That's not something that goes to the national interest of nations. Therefore, that's the incentive they have to cooperate, and we've heard no engagement upon that point either. But then they've also told us that there's the void of a permanent secretary inside the G20. We've also responded to this very clearly on this side of the house. We've told you, one, that as we've done so with the G8 and the G7, we've told you that close and repeated personal contact between the member states can do this instead. But we also want to tell you that there's a chair that presents the agendas, that decides the agendas, that takes role of managing the G20. Just because a permanent secretary doesn't exist doesn't mean we suddenly have a destruction of management within the G20, ladies and gentlemen. But then they also told us that, well, heads of states are indictedly unqualified for making decisions in these places. Therefore, we don't have in-depth discussions. But we tell you that heads of states are the most comprehensive representation of a nation's self-interest, ladies and gentlemen. That's why they represent their nation in many other conferences, in environmental conferences, in the United Nations conferences, all the time, ladies and gentlemen. Just by saying that they're not expertise, those national interests are not reflected, is nonsensical. But then they also told us that there's a lack of time, right? But what we tell you on this point is that time doesn't necessarily equal progress, ladies and gentlemen. We've told you that agendas are revealed with the G20 months before the summit is actually held. Therefore, nations have a chance to contemplate upon those issues and decide and confirm their national interests. So we have the most compact process of decision-making as possible. Therefore, just because we have more time held at the summits doesn't necessarily mean we get more progress. Therefore, their logic also fails upon that point. So secondly, let's deal with the duty of the G20 from the first place. They've told us that the G20 only deals with the economy. They're excluding environmental issues. But we tell you, one, that that's exactly the purpose of the G20 from the beginning, right? They said they'd be willing to argue upon the standards, upon the original duty of the G20, so stick to it instead of bringing up trivial other issues and being nitty-picky. But secondly, we also tell you that in fact the G20 does deal with some of these extraneous issues as well. We've had environmental talks within 2010 G20 in Seoul as well. We've had all those kinds of extraneous talks as well. They're not completely excluded from the discussions of the G20. But also, now let's talk about this important concept of communication, right? They've told us that communication is not important. They demand actual results. What we tell you is that every actions are created from basic communication in the first place. That's the same with the WTO as well. But secondly, we also tell you that the G20 summits were only started for 3 years. Therefore, if we want to evaluate the G20 at this point, we need to evaluate the efforts and the decisions they have made, instead of trying to only focus on the ends and actual gains they've gotten in the 3 years of a short-term period in the first place. But thirdly and lastly, we've continuously argued that G20 agreements are sent to IMF and other organizations that actually do have the enforcement mechanism. Thus, as in the case of the Gyeongju Agreement for the expansion of rights of emerging market countries, we see that these policies clearly have a potential to be enforced as it is sent to bodies that they praise. So thirdly and lastly, let's quickly deal with the issue of the legitimacy of G20 gathering. They've told us that the selections of members are done randomly, but we tell you that the G20 represents 85% of the world's GDP, 80% of the world's total trade, and it represents a 4 billion amount of people, ladies and gentlemen. Also, other international bodies are invited to G20 summits. But even if the selection process wasn't really legitimate, who really cares? Why does that conduce to the government's case? And upon that note, I'm extremely happy to oppose.
Speaker has spoken for 7 minutes 35 seconds.
Thank you. And lastly, from the opposition, I'd like to hear from the opposition reply.
Practical implications. This is what this debate's all about, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? So let's discuss what practical implications is before moving on to asking the fundamental question of does the G20 actually have the power to make change? So what is practical implication? Making progress, taking steps towards problem solving, ladies and gentlemen. They seem to portray a picture in which a practical implication has to be a complete solution to a global problem. But ladies and gentlemen, is that really a fair or is that really a practical answer or a practical definition of practical implications, ladies and gentlemen? If we're getting there, if we're taking steps towards a fundamental solution, then there is practical solution, then there is practical implication, because there is value in the actions and the steps that are being taken, ladies and gentlemen. The government's only major point in today's debate was that a complete solution was not here, and therefore there's no practical implication. We provide you 2 levels of refutation to this, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, negotiations by their very nature take a very long time. Take, for instance, the Korea-USA FTA, ladies and gentlemen. How long did that take? It's not even concluded as of now. The current system of the G20 summits have only been established in 2008, and you expect a complete settlement, a complete solution in 3 years, ladies and gentlemen? We believe that the idea that they're trying to portray is impractical, ladies and gentlemen. We showed you how steps were being taken, how we were making progress. We were taking steps towards the solution, and we believe that can qualify as practical implications. And also, moving on to the more fundamental question about does the G20 have the power to make change? Firstly, about representation. As our wonderful whip told you, 85% of the global GDP, 80% of world trade, and 4 billion people are represented by the 20 member organizations of the G20, 19 states plus the European Union. But moreover, we see that international organizations are invited, in addition to observer states, ladies and gentlemen. International organizations like the OECD, the United Nations, which has over 180 member states, ladies and gentlemen, and other organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and the African Union have been invited. The president of Malawi came to Seoul to represent the African Union, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that a variety of voices are being heard in these G20 summits and these G20 meetings. Also, we believe that even if the G20 lacks justification in terms of only including 20 nations, it's not really relevant to today's motion. Today's motion is not whether the G20's composition is justified. It's about whether the G20 has practical implications, whether it can actually do something, ladies and gentlemen. And we believe, because we clearly show you through tangible examples how the G20 actually contributed to solving major problems of the status quo, we believe that their reputation cannot stand. On the second subpoint about the ability to bring tangible change, they provided no rebuttal to our argument about the tangible changes that took place in the Gyeongju Agreement, the London Summit, the Seoul Summit. They say they ignore all of this, ladies and gentlemen. Also, we showed you how getting rid of the unnecessary bureaucratic procedure contributes greatly to improving effectiveness. Yet, this point they already dropped. And all they said was that head of states being there only means that that they don't have the expertise to come up with practical solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, we rebutted this by showing you that the real case is that Sherpas and many experts do go with the head of states and contribute to decision making, and in addition, that thorough reviews prior to G20 meetings do take place on major agendas. Lastly, on press and businesses, over 4,288 members of the press came to the Seoul Summit, ladies and gentlemen. Massive press attention. Yet all they said is that it's not really important because it takes place anyway. International concerns are voiced out anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that an increase in how international concerns are given light means that there's greater significance in the G20. Lastly, with regards to business and the exchange of ideas and technology transfers, this point they have neglected, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, solution through communication, progress through dialogue. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 4 minutes 13 seconds.
Now I'd like to welcome the government reply to the podium.
I'll give you 4 reasons why the government should win today. The first reason is very simple. It's because they're unfair. They made me flow during their whip and reply speech. Among the plethora of new arguments I faced, I found one very exclusive argument. The new argument that was introduced during the opposition whip speech was that because the G20 is so new and young, that we can't really expect any practical implications. They say that anything passes as practical implications because we're still in the progress. I'll be talking about the difference between basis for practical implications and practical implications in the future as well. But as for now, I'd like to say they've been greatly unfair in introducing new arguments that I feel the need to rebut first off. So that's the first reason why we should win. The second reason why we take this debate is because their argument was entirely based on the fallacy of begging the question. I quote the deputy leader of opposition. She said, "It is the burden of the government to prove that no practical implications exist. We told you a variety of reasons why they don't exist. We told you that there aren't any binding measures, therefore the states don't have an incentive to cooperate with each other." They responded by saying, "Of course they do. We gave you the example of China versus America. No further engagement." We take it that there is no incentive because that's reality. Secondly, we talked about how major powers such as Norway are excluded from the discussion, and therefore these discussions can't really reach agreement. Thirdly, we talked about conflicting, contradictory interests inside the G20. We talked about how developing countries inside the G20 don't benefit from the resolutions that it reaches, although these resolutions aren't carried out anyway. What they continue to say is that as long as we don't prove that God doesn't exist, they succeed in proving that God does exist. What kind of examples did they bring to the table? None. Their argument was based on the logical fallacy that we failed to prove that something doesn't exist. We gave you reasons why it doesn't exist. We told you that it doesn't exist. What more can we do? That's the second reason why we take this debate home. The third reason we take this debate home is because they mistook 2 different terms. First, the basis for practical implications. Secondly, practical implications themselves. Anything can be a basis for a practical implication. Me saying, "I'm going to save the world," is a basis for practical implication. If I actually go out and fight for gay rights, animal rights, that's a practical implication. They showed us communication. That's the only benefit they mentioned. Communications and agreements that will one day reach, blossom, and become practical implications. These are not the same as practical implications. The only two examples they gave us was, first of all, the $1 trillion binding agreement that reached the IMF, which didn't happen. Even if it did, they didn't show us what kind of results it yielded. And secondly, when I asked their second speaker to give me one practical implication of this year's G20 summit, she told me that they identified the reason behind the 2008 financial crisis. How are these practical implications? They aren't. That's the third reason. Fourthly and finally, they simply didn't engage in debate. First off, we rebutted their first argument of communication and about a lot of communication. We told you that communication doesn't result in anything in itself. No engagement further. Secondly, we rebutted their point on a lot of media attention. This point was untouched upon until their reply. We told you that a lot of media attention only focuses on the event itself, not the material that the event deals with. Therefore, no benefits that they promise. Wasn't engaged with. Thirdly, we talked about how G20 harms developing nations, how it's contradictory in itself to help its own member nations. Didn't engage with. Fourthly, about the BRICS versus the original Western powers, BRICS versus America, USA versus China. They told us that they would wait and see what happens. We can't see that as engagement. Fourthly and finally, they didn't engage. Because of these four reasons, today, you must vote for the government. Thank you.
We will first announce the champions of the high school overseas division, and that goes to team.
과연 어떤 팀일까요?
Which team will it be?
네, 8대 3으로 소사 1300 축하드립니다.
With an 8-3 majority, we have Team Sosa 1300 as our grand champions for the first Gwangju Youth English Debate Championships High School Overseas Division.
네, 진심으로 축하드립니다. 그래서 2위 팀은 Far East Movement 팀이 되겠습니다. 역시 축하드리겠습니다.
Once again, by default, we have Team Far East Movement as the grand finalists for our tournament.
네, 1위 팀에게 여러분 다시 한번 힘찬 박수 부탁드립니다.
A big round of applause for both teams for their successful accomplishments in this tournament.
네, 축하드립니다. 자, 이번에는 2위 팀 시상이 있겠습니다. 2위 팀에게는 광주시 교육감상과 트로피, 부상으로 장학금 100만 원이 수여됩니다.
The grand finalists for the high school overseas division will receive award from the Gwangju City Education Superintendent's Office and also a trophy as well as prize money in the amount of 1 million won.
네, Far East Movement 팀 진심으로 축하드립니다. 힘찬 박수
Congratulations, Team
부탁드릴게요.
Far East Movement.
네, 광주광역시 교육청 천성주 교육정책과장께서 시상을 해주고 계십니다. 네, 힘찬 박수 부탁드립니다.
멀리 와서 진짜 좋은 결과가 나왔으면 좋겠다고 생각을 하고 있었는데 정말 최선을 다했는데 좋은 결과가 뒤따라줘서 되게 보람찼던 것 같습니다.
일단 저희 지도 교사신 저희 많이 지도해 주신 데 애쓰신 메인 본가드나 선생님께 되게 감사드리고요. 제가 지금 대회 많이 나와본 게 아닌데 저희 잘 도와주신 선배분들한테 되게 감사드립니다.
저 역시 저희 팀메이트인 예린이가 얘기한 그 모든 지도교사 선생님 또 저희 학교에서 도와주신 모든 분들께 너무너무 감사드리고요. 그다음에 항상 저희 어머니께서 이걸 부탁을 하셨는데 이렇게 공개적인 장소에서 기회가 된다면 말해달라고 하셔서 저희 어머니한테도 너무너무 감사드립니다. 이과 쪽으로 저는 로봇공학 쪽을 꿈으로 해서 로봇 경영학을 좀 배워보고 싶습니다.
앞으로 이번 대회에서 쌓은 영어로 서로 대화하는 거나 아니면 제 주장을 펼칠 수 있는 논리 같은 것도 이과에게 매우 중요한 거라고 들었어요. 그래서 이번에 대회에서 배운 것을 앞으로 써서 국제이과 생물을 학자로 하고 싶은 길에서도 많은 도움이 되었으면 좋겠습니다.
전 이번 대회를 통해서 설득의 기술을 배운 것 같아요. 그래서 영어나 프랑스어 같이 외국어를 통해서 국익에 이바지하고 싶고요. 외교관이 돼서 최선을 다하고 싶습니다. 저희도 대부분 고등학교에 들어와서 시작한 경우가 많거든요. 그래서 최선을 다하고 많이 읽고 이것저것 시사 문제에 대해서 관심을 갖고 노력하다 보면 좋은 결과가 뒤따를 수 있는 것 같습니다.
인사고 파이팅!
The great escape. We won't hear a word they say. They don't know us.